So the topic is the Second Vatican Council. So first question is, what is the Second Vatican Council? The answer is it's the 21st Ecumenical Council of the Catholic Church. Ecumenical Council means general or universal council, right? So it's when all the Catholic bishops gather in some place to discuss the most pressing matters and questions facing the church at the time. And the first one was the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, and again, the 21st one took place in Rome at the Vatican, hence it's called the Second Vatican Council. There was one before at the Vatican in 1870, and it's the most recent ecumenical council of the Catholic Church. It was called by Pope John the 23rd shortly after he was elected in 1958. He announced that he would summon an ecumenical council. It was carried out in Vatican City in 4 sessions in the fall of each year from 1962 to 1965. And it was John the 23rd died in 1963, and so the council was concluded by Pope Paul VI, the next pope. And it is possibly the single most important event in the Catholic Church in the 20th century. In my opinion, it is one of the most significant world historical events of the 20th century, period. Like, not just for Catholics, but world historical. I think it's extremely important in world history. So, okay, I've told you at its most basic what Vatican II is. If you ask, what did Vatican II do? So, the interpretation of Vatican II is something that people have great disagreements about. Like, what is the true nature of Vatican II? What's the true meaning of it? And so on. So, depending on which Catholic intellectual you pick, the lecture on Vatican II in this class could be very different, right? I'm going to try to give you a non-partisan view. At the same time, I want to tell you the truth as I see it. And the truth, it's like, can't avoid being partisan in the sense that the truth is always opposed to error, right? So there's certainly going to be an element of my own interpretation, but I'm going to try to do it in a relatively non-partisan way so that regardless of how my own point of view influences it, you'll at least have an accurate knowledge of the basic picture, right? So, okay, my proposal for the heart of what Vatican II did is it changed the church's approach to the modern world. Changed the church's approach to the modern world. So first, let's look at the old approach before Vatican II, so we understand the nature of the change, right? So the old approach to the modern world before Vatican II, it basically, you could date it back to the French Revolution. So you could say 1789 to let's say 58, let's say when John the 23rd was elected. 1789 to 1958 is the time of the old approach to the modern world. So let me give you a bit of historical background. All of this is review. I discussed all of this in the church history section at the beginning of the course, but it was a while ago. So the French Revolution, in my opinion, inaugurated a new age in Western history. Above all, a new age in terms of the relationship of the Catholic Church with Western civilization. So when people nowadays talk about Western values, which is kind of a big hot button topic these days, when people today talk about Western values, they tend to be speaking about modern Western values. They tend to speak as though these modern Western values are something that emerged as a kind of evolutionary outcome of all of Western history going back to ancient Greece and Rome. Right? The idea like these Western values are something we get from the whole heritage of the last 2,500 years. And so I'm talking about Western values like secularism, separation of church and state, capitalism, liberal democracy, individualism, freedom of speech in relation to religion, blasphemy, obscenity, things like this. But actually, many of these modern Western values come from an outright rejection of the previous tradition of Western civilization, which I called Christendom, right? The Christian civilization exemplified by the Christendom of the Middle Ages. These modern Western values come from a rejection of that tradition, basically. So in other words, a modern Western civilization emerged at a certain point in history from the medieval Christian civilization that went before it. Right? So I would say, if you say the words Western civilization, I want you to clarify which one you're talking about. Are you talking about the modern one, or are you talking about the old Christian one? Because they're, in my opinion, pretty diametrically opposed. And if you want to set a date for when Western civilization divorced itself from the Catholic Church and from Christian civilization, I think the French Revolution of 1789 is a good date to set for that. It's a long phenomenon, but 1789 is an important date. So 1789 inaugurated a new age, again, in the relationship of the Catholic Church with Western civilization. The French Revolution was based on a revolutionary ideology, which is usually called liberalism. And the essence of liberalism is to remove the individual's obligation to any authority outside him or herself. That is basically the essence of it. All authority comes from within the individual, from him or her consenting to some authority or from his or her reason or what have you. So with the French Revolution, they abolished the monarchy and replaced it with a republic. And the Republic of the French Revolution was theoretically based on the consent and representation of all citizens, although in actual fact it was a violent totalitarian state. But that was the theory behind the Republic. The French Revolution abolished the church and replaced it with a state-instituted religion, which was enforced by law. And this measure, the enforcement of a state-imposed religion, was explicitly proposed by the liberal thinker Jean-Jacques Rousseau in his work, The Social Contract. He said, this is before the French Revolution, he's one of the most important liberal thinkers. He said, the state has to have at least a minimum amount of religion so that people believe they ought to obey their duties to the state. And so he proposed this, and this was then implemented by the French Revolution. But again, the theory was this is actually coming from the individuals consenting to live under this government. It's not a religion imposed on people from outside. It's like the people themselves are doing it, in theory. In the later evolution of liberalism, there was a kind of further evolution towards abolishing the family as a source of authority and abolishing religion itself, like communism, which I would say is a kind of, product of evolution from liberalism. All the communist revolutions have immediately gone on to persecute the church, try to wipe out the church, and so on. So liberalism became the dominant political creed of the 19th century in most of the Western countries. So this is the historical background for, again, what I'm going to describe as the old approach to the modern world. The liberal creed aimed to implement a policy of religious indifferentism. You remember I explained that? Or even political atheism in Western states, in the sense that the state should take no stance on religion, should not attempt to base the state's law on the law of God or on the Ten Commandments or the Christian religion or church teaching or what have you. The state should be either indifferent to religion or officially secular, right? And many state governments in these 150 years or so after the French Revolution were outright hostile to the Catholic Church. Even apart from the Communist Revolution, the governments of Germany, France, and Mexico all went through periods of actively persecuting the church. So during this time, there were many Catholics in leading positions, like Catholic statesmen and bishops and theologians and writers who were influenced by liberalism and embraced some liberal ideas or embraced liberalism outright, while calling themselves or remaining Catholics religiously, right? And they tended to call themselves liberal Catholics. So there was a whole movement within the church by people embracing ideas of liberalism. And they generally proposed that even Catholic countries where like 95% of the population was Catholic, should adopt an approach of indifferentism in terms of the government, propose that the church should not be acknowledged or supported by the state, and so on. So this was the essential problem faced by the popes from about 1789 to, let's say, around 1900. The question facing the popes was, can Catholics be liberals? Right? Or should they be? Should they be liberals? Because many Catholics were rapidly becoming liberals. So here's the old approach. The popes after 1789 issued repeated statements protesting against the injustices committed by liberals against the rights of Catholics, against the rights of the church, and against what they called the rights of God. refuting and condemning various elements of liberalism, condemning various political organizations associated with liberalism, especially the Freemasons. I don't know if I've mentioned them in this class, but secret society. And eventually the popes also condemned specific Catholic writers who proposed liberal ideas. So this culminated with the first syllabus of errors of Pope Pius IX in 1864. So I've got that term on here, the syllabus of errors, 1864. So this was a list of 80 propositions, just statements, right? Statements of opinion or belief. 80 propositions, for the most part associated with liberalism, but also some other new modern ideas about philosophy, religion, church and state, etc. So just listed these propositions and condemned them and said all of these are erroneous and contrary to Catholic teaching and should not be held by Catholics. They should all be condemned by Catholics. And number 80, it kind of summed them all up. Number 80 said the Roman pontiff, the Pope, can and should reconcile and adapt himself to progress, liberalism, and the modern world. Condemned, right? This is not to be held or believed by Catholics. Now, in a letter published with the syllabus of errors, Pope Pius IX declared, not only should Catholics not believe these things, but these things are contrary to the scriptures, contrary to the tradition of the church fathers, and contrary to the teaching of the church. He didn't use the word heresy, but it's pretty close to a condemnation as heresy. Now, so that's up to about 1900. By about the year 1900, the focus shifted to a new set of ideas spreading among leading Catholic intellectuals, a set of ideas called modernism. Now, modernism is kind of hard to define. The single best document ever written on the subject of modernism that I'm aware of is by Pope St. Pius X. It's an encyclical letter called Pascendi Dominici Gregis, and it was published on September 8, 1907. So that's the Latin title. I'm going to write it down for you. I think I included it in that list of documents that I gave you after the last lecture. So if you want to sort of understand this phenomenon, that's the best place to go. Just read that encyclical. The term modernism, again, it's a little hard to define because it's also used in reference to artistic movements and architecture and other things, even literature, and it's used in a different sense there. But we're talking about modernism in theology. So in theology, modernism at its broadest is based on an idea that it's not possible for humans to really know the truth, to really know objective truth about the world outside their own minds. Instead, all that human beings have is their subjective impressions. It's like the outside world makes a kind of impression on your mind or your senses, and that's all that you can really know. You can't know the reality beyond them. And so, therefore, again, we can't know anything for certain outside of ourselves. And so the modernist approach to religion is that religious impulses arise spontaneously out of people's subjective religious sense, that people have this kind of inborn religious sense or longing for meaning or something, and their religious impulses arise from that. But they all get sort of filtered through the person's subjective, experience and feelings and so on. And eventually, through sharing of sentiments among a community of people, this aggregates into a stable religion, and you get an actual religion, like Christianity or Judaism or what have you. But again, the idea is that these religions, according to modernists, are not directly established by God through external acts like miracles or divine revelation or what have you. They're just the product of the evolution of a community of people's religious sense, right? And again, because we can't know the external world, you can't verify that God has intervened in history at any one place or time. So at the same time, the modernists think that these religions are important because they express people's collective religious sense and they give meaning to their lives and so on. So the practical conclusion of this, of the modernist view of religion, is modernists generally believe that people should continue to practice their religions, right? They should practice and believe in their religions, but they should not view them as immutable, unchangeable things and they should not view them as established by God. They should view it like everything can continue to evolve further in new historical circumstances. And so Catholics influenced by modernism, usually they didn't want to abolish the Catholic religion, or they didn't leave the church, right? They wanted to keep practicing Catholicism and usually keep the external forms of the Catholic religion. So they would profess the same creed, right, the Apostles' Creed, they would attend the same Mass, and so on. But they wanted to change the inner meaning of these things to something that they thought was more modern and harmonious with the modern outlook. So that's the hallmark of modernism, is you keep the externals of the religion, but you change the internal meaning based on evolving religious sense, right? Evolving subjective sort of consciousness. So this is the new issue arising around the year 1900, right? Liberalism has sort of been dealt with within the Catholic Church, but now it's modernism. Now, St. Pius X, my favorite pope, right? He saw the danger of these ideas, and during his time as pope, he carried out a crusade against modernism within the church. And in my personal opinion, this is one of the wisest and best policies ever undertaken by the popes. I think that this was the perfect time and approach to this problem. So in Pascendi Dominici Gregis, St. Pius X described modernism as the synthesis of all heresies, or the meeting point of all heresies. He said it's not just a heresy against one article of the creed, it essentially abolishes all religion, because it abolishes any objective basis for them in truth, right? So he then issued his own syllabus of errors in 1907, targeting modernist ideas. So this is the second syllabus of errors, 1907. Now, again, recommended reading is the 1907 syllabus of errors. The name in Latin is Lamentabili. St. Pius X also required all Catholic priests, bishops, and seminary professors and Catholic university professors to swear an anti-modernist oath before they took up their post, and to renew that oath every year. So in this oath, they would explicitly reject these modernist ideas and swear that they adhered to the traditional meaning of the Catholic faith. Not just that they profess the same words of the creed, but hold to the same traditional meaning of the Catholic faith. So this is the old approach, right, that I'm describing. Now, when Pope John the 23rd was elected in 1958, only a few months after his election, he proclaimed that he intended to call an ecumenical council. And the purpose of the council he summed up in some of the speeches that he gave in 1958 up to about 1960. He summed up the purpose of the council with two Italian words, aggiornamento and apertura. And these mean updating and opening. So aggiornamento, updating, meant to bring the church up to date with modern needs. So the fact is that this does sometimes need to be done with certain traditions and institutions within the Catholic Church, at least, because ways of doing things that are not part of the essentials of the faith do need to be changed occasionally, do need to be updated or reformed from time to time. And even St. Pius X himself had actually carried out a reform of some parts of the liturgy, a reform of the breviary, which is the prayer book of the Divine Office, reformed some aspects of the Mass. He had made an innovation by encouraging daily communion, which was an acceptable practice before, but he openly encouraged it. So, this is not in itself like a problem. The second word was apertura, or opening. So it's usually used, the phrase usually used is opening the windows. To open the windows to the modern world, to encourage constructive dialogue with the modern world, and for Catholics to engage with modern ideas. And so this, again, is the heart of what Vatican II did. It changed the Church's approach to the modern world, from the old approach exemplified in the Syllabus of Errors to a new approach that was oriented toward dialogue and engagement with modern ideas. So, first of all, this was done simply by John the 23rd's statements, even before the council began, because he encouraged a new attitude of openness to the modern world and invited criticism of Catholic traditions or proposals for reform of Catholic traditional things and traditional Catholic things and so on. And he said in his opening speech that he disagreed with the prophets of doom who claimed that things were getting worse in modern history. He expressed optimism about the direction of modern history. So first of all, that in itself was a change of approach. During the council, there were 16 documents drafted by committees. The committees were usually made up of both bishops and theologians. And these 16 documents were then issued by the bishops. So each document was proposed at the end of the writing process to the whole assembly of bishops who were there in Rome. And every bishop would vote either yes with reservations, like on the whole, it's okay, but I would like to see some changes made, or no on each document. So all of these 16 documents that were issued passed through a vote of all the bishops. Now, there's an interesting event that a lot of people discuss. I don't have much to say about it, but a lot of people discuss when they talk about Vatican II. In the preparation for the council before it opened, a number of documents were drafted in advance by a committee of the Roman Curia, the sort of officials who work for the Pope in Rome. And these were proposed to the bishops when they first arrived in 1962. And the bishops voted to scrap all those documents and start fresh. So there's a lot of speculation about what was in those documents and what the outcome would have been if those had been kept. Again, I don't really have anything much to say about it. Now, in terms of the events of the council, I'm not going to go through in detail, but there's a book which narrates the events of the council and the voting that was written by an American journalist who was present at the Second Vatican Council. The book is called The Rhine Flows into the Tiber, and it's been republished recently under a different title. I think it's called like The Real History of Vatican II or something like that, but the original title is The Rhine Flows into the Tiber. So this journalist, his name's Ralph Wiltgen, his observation about the events of the council is that there was a somewhat liberal group of bishops who were mainly from the countries which border on the Rhine River in Europe, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany, Austria, Switzerland. And this group of bishops on the liberal end of things, they banded together early on and decisively influenced the documents and the voting in a relatively liberal direction. So that was what he observed at the council. Joseph Ratzinger, who was elected Pope as Benedict XVI, was actually a theologian who assisted one of these bishops, a bishop from Switzerland, I believe. So he was present, he was involved with writing some of the documents. There was also a conservative/traditionalist group of bishops that also formed, but they were much smaller in number and much less well-organized and less successful in influencing the direction. The most famous member of these bishops is a bishop named Marcel Lefebvre, that I'm going to mention a little later on. He was from France. So to sum up the documents as a whole, the whole group of 16 documents, the bishops took up the goals of aggiornamento, updating, and apertura, opening. They took up those goals very enthusiastically and proposed updating in many different areas of the church and a new openness to dialogue with the modern world and to Catholics taking up modern ideas. So that's the overall direction of the Second Vatican Council. I'll give you some specific highlights from the documents. One of the early documents was a constitution on the sacred liturgy, and it proposed a reform of the Latin liturgical rite. And beginning with the Mass, but also the liturgies for all the other sacraments and the divine office. So this liturgical reform was carried out in the decades after Vatican II. There was a constitution on the Church that expanded on the First Vatican Council's teaching about the nature of the Church. It taught that in addition to a pope, an ecumenical council can also teach infallibly when it defines a dogma on faith and morals, although Vatican II did not infallibly define any dogmas. There were decrees on the Eastern churches, on other Christian denominations, and on other non-Christian religions. Among other things, they said that the Eastern rites within the Catholic Church are equal in dignity and value to the Latin rite, so there's no sort of preference for the Latin rite. They expressed a positive view of the Eastern Orthodox tradition and of Protestant denominations. They pointed out what they share in common with Catholicism. The documents expressed a positive view of other religions, and again pointed out what elements of truth and goodness these other religions possessed, although they didn't claim that a person can be saved through any other religion than the Catholic Church. Other decrees encouraged collegiality in the church, so that is more participation by the bishops of the world in the Pope's government of the church. To a limited extent, more involvement of lay people in the government of the church. A constitution on divine revelation taught fairly traditional teaching about divine revelation and sacred scripture. Did encourage the use of modern approaches to the historical study of the Bible and collaboration with non-Catholic scholars. And then 3 decrees are the most revolutionary. So there was a decree on ecumenism. Ecumenism means dialogue among Christians, dialogue of Catholics with non-Catholic Christians. So the decree on ecumenism encouraged dialogue and collaboration of Catholics with non-Catholic Christians, encouraged Catholics to adopt a positive outlook on non-Catholic denominations rather than a negative one. One result of this is the widespread dropping of the term heresy in Catholic vocabulary. It's considered a sort of politically incorrect term. And the decree on ecumenism also encouraged a limited amount of worship in common, right? So Protestants and Catholics, being involved in each other's liturgical actions or praying together and so on. There was a declaration on religious freedom. That's the second most revolutionary document. It declared that the human person has the right to religious freedom and that this should become a civil right in all states. Now, the interpretation of this in harmony with traditional Catholic teaching is somewhat complicated, but in my opinion, it is in harmony with traditional Catholic teaching. We might talk about that a bit when we talk about the second reading that was assigned for today. And then finally, the third most sort of revolutionary document was the Constitution on the Church in the Modern World. And it's a kind of overview of modern history. It's like the bishops basically just talk about all these different new modern developments, things going on in the modern world. And they often make specific criticisms of evils or faulty ideas or what have you. But the document overall presents a very optimistic view of the modern world and modern history. So in sum, what Vatican II did, again, is change the Church's approach to the modern world from this old, you could say, negative approach to a new positive approach, right? Approach focused on engagement and dialogue and so on. Now, the Council, all of these documents they were just documents in the beginning. The implementation of the Council was carried out by Pope Paul VI, right? Elected in 1963 and then Pope for about 15 years. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the implementation and then some of the ramifications of Vatican II. The key years for the implementation of the Council are 1967 to 1969. And it's kind of interesting that those are the key years because the year 1968, a heck of a lot happened across the whole world in 1968. And that it's, strange coincidence that also a lot of things happened within the Catholic Church in 1968. So my observation on the implementation by Paul VI is that Paul VI's implementation of the Council shows 2 contrary tendencies that are at times almost in conflict with one another. There's an embrace of the new, and then on the other hand, there's a reaffirmation of the old, right? And putting the brakes on from going too far into the new or, too revolutionary. So in terms of embracing the new, Paul VI carried out the liturgical reform. And this is by far the most visible ramification of Vatican II for most Catholics, right? Like everybody practically in the world who goes into a Catholic church for Mass experiences the result of the liturgical reform, the new Mass, right? So a new liturgy for the Latin Rite was drawn up in 1967. I described this as the Novus Ordo Mass when I talked about liturgical rites. It was issued to the whole Latin Church in Advent of 1969. So this Sunday would be the 50th anniversary of the implementation of the liturgical reform, right? This is the first Sunday of Advent coming up. You can correct me if I'm wrong. I'm pretty sure about that. So the hallmark of the new rubrics, like I highlighted when I talked about liturgical rites, was freedom and options. A lot more freedom given to priests in how they actually sort of celebrated the liturgy. In local parishes, a lot of priests took the innovations much farther than the rubrics actually required or suggested. And so there was a huge variety in approaches to the way that priests said Mass, the kind of liturgical music used, and so on. Even to this day, there's a lot of diversity in that. But the end result of the liturgical reform is that in the vast majority of Catholic parishes today, the new Mass is said in the local language, right, not in Latin, with the priest facing the people like I am right now, as opposed to facing the altar like this, as in the Latin Mass, with a wide variety of different liturgical music styles, but usually something involved with the local culture, right? In the 1970s in North America, there was a lot of folk music, right? But the music is very different in different places and times. So Latin has largely gone from the daily life of the church and Gregorian chant. Those were Gregorian chant was the normal language of the old liturgy. There were some very bitter disputes about the liturgical reform when it was implemented and about liturgical music. J.R.R. Tolkien, who was a Catholic, famously, he continued to say the Latin responses very loudly for the rest of his life. He was very annoyed about this. I would say in general, the liturgical reform was well received, but there was some controversy and some bitterness, and there were groups of Catholics who wanted to hold on to the Latin Mass. Now, they were given limited permission to do this by Pope John Paul II in the 1980s, and then this permission was extended more broadly by Pope Benedict XVI, so that now any group of Catholics basically who request from their priest to have Latin Mass, the priest is allowed to do it if he chooses to. And so, again, now there is a regular Sunday Latin Mass in Winnipeg. That's been since probably about 2010. So that's the embrace of the new by Paul VI. On the other hand, you have the reaffirmation of the old. And this is summed up in two documents, both issued in the summer of 1968. Humanae Vitae and the Credo of the People of God. So, Humanae Vitae first. Humanae Vitae is probably one of the most famous encyclicals of the last century, and it's an encyclical on the subject of birth control. Paul VI was asked during the Second Vatican Council if there would be a change in the Church's teaching on birth control. This was particularly prompted because the hormonal birth control pill had been invented in the 1950s. And so Pope Paul VI had been asked about this, and he had organized a commission of experts to study the question and then give him their opinion. And in 1968, he issued an encyclical about the subject, and what he did is reaffirm the Church's traditional teaching that artificial birth control is immoral, and the only way for married couples to legitimately space out children or avoid further children is through either complete abstinence or periodic abstinence, abstaining from intercourse during a woman's fertile period of her cycle. It's usually nowadays called NFP, natural family planning. So there was immediately a massive controversy about this within the Catholic world. A huge number of Catholic intellectuals and also many priests and some bishops basically rejected the Pope's teaching in Humanae Vitae and said, despite this, we think he's wrong. Basically, we think he's wrong, and we're going to teach or advise the opposite, or we're going to tell couples that they should just follow their own conscience on this question. Now, it just occurred to me, I don't have this in my notes, but there's actually a Winnipeg connection here. The bishops of Canada in, I think it was maybe 1970 or so, issued a statement called the Winnipeg Statement. Has anyone heard of this? Yeah. Okay. The Winnipeg Statement was a statement about the subject of sexual morals and birth control, and the key paragraph said basically parish priests should advise couples to follow their conscience on this subject. So they didn't outright reject the teaching, but they basically said, we're not going to tell parish priests to insist upon this in what they say to couples. It's somewhat infamous in the sort of pro-life community in Canada, and it was called the Winnipeg Statement because the bishops gathered in Winnipeg to discuss it and then issued the document from Winnipeg. So, okay. So Humanae Vitae there, he reaffirmed the old teaching. The Credo of the People of God is the same idea, and it was issued only about a week before Humanae Vitae, but much more comprehensive. And it's not a famous document. Not many people have heard of the Credo of the People of God, but in my opinion, it's a really important, significant document. So, June 30th, 1968, what Paul VI did is he publicly, in St. Peter's, at the end of meeting with several groups of bishops, I think, he said he wished to pronounce a statement of the Catholic faith that would answer the needs of the contemporary time and especially would essentially reject many contemporary popular errors and reaffirm the traditional Catholic teaching. And then he said this creed out loud, and then it was published in a document that's available on the Vatican website if you just search for Credo of the People of God. Now, this, in my personal opinion, is an amazing document. I love the Credo of the People of God. They're basically what I think Pope Paul VI saw by 1968 was that a lot of people had been very caught up with enthusiasm during the Second Vatican Council, and we're basically looking at it like we've got a blank slate, right? Like anything goes. You can change any doctrine of Catholicism. We can change any practice, whatever. And Paul VI, with this credo, reaffirmed a very large number of traditional teachings that were rapidly falling by the wayside. If you have any sort of acquaintance with the intellectual culture within the Catholic Church of the last 50 years, and then you read that document, you see like boom, 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 boom. It's like a checklist of things that had been sort of becoming unpopular or again falling by the wayside or what have you. So you can see this contradictory tendency with Paul VI. He was sort of fighting with, he clearly embraced the intention of Vatican II in general, but he was fighting with the tendency for it to keep going too far beyond what he thought was acceptable for Catholicism. Now, further ramifications. A very large number of priests, monks, and nuns abandoned the religious celibate life in the years immediately after Vatican II and left the priesthood or left the religious orders. And there was a major decline in vocations to the priesthood and religious life. Now, I don't claim to know what the causes are, but the timing coincides with the end of Vatican II for whatever reason. Another ramification is the secularization of many Catholic societies. So Quebec went through the Quiet Revolution in the mid-1960s, and again, seems probably connected to Vatican II. Spain and Portugal also, which had been, you could say they had been under right-wing authoritarian regimes that supported the Catholic Church. They gradually moved in a direction of secularism. So finally, on the subject of legacy and ramifications, if you asked, was it a success or failure in terms of, the outcome? Yeah, first of all, it's not my place to judge, right? Like, my opinion really doesn't matter on this, but I'll give you a few of my thoughts. And again, I'm going to try to be nonpartisan, but tell you what I think is the truth. So on the negative side, in terms of failures, I personally am a pretty strong fan of the old syllabus of errors approach. I think that there's lots of historical evidence that it was actually very effective in the century and a half after the French Revolution. There were certainly lots of people who left the church, but there were far fewer people who left the church proportionately than there were in the last half century, since 1965. A lot more people annually have been leaving the church since Vatican II than there were before. And there were also a lot of conversions to Catholicism during the time of the syllabus of errors. Catholics had a very strong identity as a people, with distinct people. They were very firm and steadfast in rejecting modern errors and revolutionary ideologies. They were very devoted to the church. There was high attendance at the sacraments, and religious education of Catholics was pretty effective. So again, on the negative side, in the decades after Vatican II, it seems as though the direction of influence between the church and the world reversed. So previously, Catholics had always tried to influence the world in a Christian direction, right? That's what they viewed their job as. Since Vatican II, increasingly, Catholics look to the world and the trends and ideas of the world and take their direction from there, and tend to view the church as sort of behind the times or as needing to catch up, right? Now, in my opinion, this is not a good change. On the positive side, in terms of successes, first, I look at it in terms of divine providence, and so I assume that God knows what he's doing. Perhaps something far worse was prevented by Vatican II, but I would have no way of knowing about it since it didn't happen, right? So I assume that it fits into God's providence, first of all. Another point, though, in terms of specific points, it's possible that many people who are Catholics today would have left the church if it had maintained its old stance. There are a lot of people I know who are still practicing Catholics today that I suspect would have left the church if it had maintained its uncompromising public stance. One clear positive that I think is connected to Vatican II is that for the last 50 years, the church has enjoyed very wide freedom to operate within all Western countries and freedom to govern itself, right? This was not at all the case in the previous century and a half. In the century and a half after the French Revolution, by and large, the church in Western countries was either actively persecuted or was dominated and manipulated as a tool of the state. So the fact that the church is basically left alone and governs itself and can do what it wants and can pursue, missionary activity and so on within Western countries, I think it has a lot to do with the fact that Vatican II changed the church's approach to modern ideologies and so on. Now, finally, on the legacy of Vatican II. Now, I want to explain to you what I see as the three camps of Catholics today, the three camps that Catholics today fall into. Now, again, probably a lot of people would consider my approach to this partisan. I'll try not to be partisan, but this is something that I wish had been explained to me when I was coming into the church, because I had to figure it out on my own for a number of years. The primary source of divisions among Catholics today, I would say, is the legacy of Vatican II. And that's whether the individual Catholic knows it or not. A lot of people don't realize that that's actually what's sort of under the surface, but I would say that's the primary source of division. So there's basically three camps in relation to the interpretation of Vatican II. Liberal Catholics, conservative Catholics, and traditionalist Catholics. And these terms are widely used. They're not perfect terms, but most people who follow Catholic things are familiar with them and know roughly what they mean. So liberal, conservative, traditionalist. Okay, so Catholics all over the world, especially in the Western countries, are divided into these three camps, by and large. Liberal Catholics. Liberal Catholics embrace Vatican II and generally think it did not go far enough. Right? That's basically what unites liberal Catholics. So, again, I'm going to try and give you a charitable statement of all of these views. So charitably speaking, I would say liberals think that Vatican II inaugurated a new modern era in the church which ought to involve continuous progress and evolution and reform in all aspects of Catholicism. And they usually think that these goals have not been fully achieved since Vatican II. So the stereotype is that liberals are waiting for Vatican III, right? So some specific things that liberal Catholics generally want. Moral approval of contraception, ordination of women to the priesthood, right? And more democratic government in the church. These are three things that commonly unite liberal Catholics. Each of these, so I'm going to try to give you a charitable explanation of each of these views, and then I'm going to point out what I see as some problems with each of these views. And each of them has what I see as problems. Problems with liberal Catholicism. In my opinion, it tends to reduce Catholicism to basically a broad liberal form of Protestantism, or even to Unitarianism. Right? Unitarianism, it's like you all worship together, you all profess belief in some God, but it's up to everybody individually to figure out what God they actually believe in. In my opinion, liberal Catholicism tends to reduce Catholicism to this, to a church without dogmas, with no divinely instituted hierarchy, and not more truly the Church of Christ than any other. And likewise, the liberal Catholic outlook often seems to be based on modernist assumptions. I think you can see that if you read like Pascendi Dominici Gregis. So those are what I see as problems. Now, for each of these, I would say, just speaking loosely, you could probably associate each of them with a favorite pope since Vatican II. I would say of the popes since Vatican II, the liberals' favorite is Francis. Okay. Conservative Catholics. Conservative Catholics embrace Vatican II and they are happy with how far it went, right? They think it went far enough and what it did was good. So typically conservative Catholics are pro-life, right, in relation to abortion, contraception, and so on. They're usually happy with the liturgical reform. They're happy with the current form of the Mass and so on. They're happy with the new approach to religious liberty and ecumenism and so on. They think it's important to be faithful to the letter of Vatican II, so what Vatican II actually said in the documents and asked to be done, and to the teaching of the Pope since Vatican II. Liberals, the stereotype is they don't care about the letter, they love the spirit of Vatican II, right? What's important is the new spirit that it inaugurated. So, conservatives. Problems with conservative Catholicism. I would say the biggest one is conservative Catholics tend to treat Vatican II as a sieve, a filter, right? Pre-Vatican II dogmas and teachings and ways of doing things are only relevant if they passed through the filter of Vatican II. So if it's an old thing and it is embraced or stated in the documents of Vatican II, then we keep it. But if it's an old thing and it's never mentioned in the documents of Vatican II, you might as well forget it. Like, it didn't make it through the filter, right? So that, I would say, is the characteristic overarching problem of conservative Catholicism. What was not endorsed or taught by Vatican II can be forgotten, basically, or should be. The conservatives, again, just speaking loosely, favorite pope is probably Pope John Paul II. Pope since Vatican II, anyway. Traditionalist Catholics. Traditionalist Catholics, you could sum it up, they do not embrace Vatican II. They prefer the old ways. What unites most traditionalists, in addition to not embracing Vatican II, is a preference for the Latin Mass. Most traditionalists, they all love the Latin Mass. Sometimes traditionalists even say, we don't agree on anything except we all love the Latin Mass, right? So traditionalists themselves are a very divided group. They're divided, I would say, into three broad camps. So we're getting now into subdivisions. There are what you could call Latin Mass Catholics. Anybody heard of Taylor Marshall? He's on YouTube. Taylor Marshall, I would say, is a textbook Latin Mass traditionalist Catholic. So they're just Catholics who prefer to go to the Latin Mass, who are not happy with Vatican II, and they're traditionalists. But basically, they're just normal members of the church apart from that. I would say their favorite pope is Pope Benedict XVI. There are SSPX Catholics. Anybody heard of the Lefebvrists or SSPX? No? Okay, well, I'm introducing you to something completely new then. I mentioned Archbishop Lefebvre as one of the members of that conservative group of bishops at Vatican II. In the decades after Vatican II, he founded a sort of religious order. It's like a brotherhood of priests. And he came to believe that Vatican II had essentially betrayed the Catholic faith. It wasn't just that he wasn't happy with the overall direction. He thought it fundamentally betrayed the Catholic faith. And in, I think it was 1984, maybe 1982, he was sort of on his deathbed, and he decided that in order to protect and transmit the Catholic faith, he needed to ordain bishops who would follow him in his sort of approach to things and would preserve the traditional faith. And so he ordained 4 bishops, and he was excommunicated by Pope John Paul II for this. And the society that he founded, the abbreviation that it goes under is SSPX, Society of St. Pius X. Now, I'm not a member of the SSPX, even though my favorite pope is St. Pius X. We just happen to like the same pope. So SSPX, they are not recognized by the church, but they run parishes that offer the Latin Mass all over, especially the Western world, like they're big in France and Canada and the United States. So they operate basically in defiance of the Pope and the Vatican. They're not explicitly heretical or schismatic or anything or excommunicated, but they're not like they're not officially recognized or approved by the church. So they're in this kind of awkward gray area. There is an SSPX chapel in Winnipeg. And finally, the third camp of traditionalists are called sede vacantis. It's from the word sede, the phrase sede vacante means the seat is vacant. It's a very small number, but they're kind of influential. Catholics who believe that John the 23rd and Paul VI were actually heretics, and that Vatican II was not a valid or legitimate ecumenical council at all, and generally believe that there has not been a valid pope since 1958 or 1965, something like that. So they also operate like parishes and Latin Mass chapels and schools and so on. in the United States and Canada and Europe, they believe that there is no valid pope right now, and they're sort of waiting for the men that they regard as heretics to be replaced by valid popes. So, okay. Problems with the traditionalist view, just across all of these camps. I mean, it kind of depends on the particulars because, again, it's a divided group, wide range of views among traditionalists on how to precisely interpret Vatican II, etc. But one common problem in the culture of traditionalist Catholics that I observe is disrespect for the authority of Vatican II and the post-Vatican II popes. So a lot of Catholics who are not members of SSPX or Sedevacantists or whatever, they're Catholics in good standing, they're members of the church. A lot of traditionalist Catholics have a habit of criticizing or disparaging Vatican II and the popes since Vatican II in a way that they would never do with councils or popes from before then, right? Like, you would never talk that way about the Council of Trent as a pious, faithful Catholic, but you'll talk in a very critical, disparaging way about Vatican II. In my opinion, this frequently leads traditionalists into errors and vices and problems and so on. So, okay, what's the status quo then between these three groups? If these are the three main groups, what's the status quo? Just speaking anecdotally, from my observation, I would say numerically the liberals are dominant. There are more liberal Catholics than any other camp, I would say. However, the actual policy pursued by the popes and bishops since Vatican II has largely been a sort of moderate conservative policy. So I would say John Paul II is a textbook conservative. So the direction of the church largely was steered in a kind of conservative way after Vatican II. Possible change with Pope Francis, but I don't really know. The traditionalists, the conservative Catholics, a lot of leading Catholic intellectuals are conservative Catholics, like political commentators, writers, and so on. A lot of them are conservative Catholics. The traditionalists are a small minority in terms of numbers, but one thing that they have that the other groups don't have is they're growing. They're growing in terms of Catholics sort of becoming traditionalists, but also, if you go to a Latin Mass, you will see a large number of young people with young children, like young families with young children. The Latin Mass that I saw most recently, I think about 50% of the people attending were children under 12. So they tend to attract young people and also tend to have lots of children. And so in a kind of Darwinian battle, they're likely to win in the end, right? In my opinion, the traditionalists also are the main group that are preserving and continuing the Catholic intellectual tradition that goes back to St. Thomas Aquinas and so on. Now, okay, I don't know if you care where I stand on this. I don't know if you're wondering. When I took classes, I always wondered what his stance on things was. So I'll tell you. I would have to be a traditionalist. In my humble opinion, liberal Catholicism and conservative Catholicism involve fundamental contradictions to basic Catholic belief in the Church and divine revelation. I think there are fundamental problems with those views. So you would have to put me in the traditionalist camp. But I have tried to make clear that, in my opinion, there are problems and dangers present in each of these camps, and I don't think that any of them is safe. So I don't think that traditionalists are safe from problems or errors and so on. I try to steer clear of these dangers as best I can. One of those dangers that I highlighted was the tendency to be a habit of criticism and disparagement of the authorities in the church. So I try not to do that while also trying to tell the truth as I see it. So try to stick with the truth, even though it often sets me at odds with many other Catholics. So my goal is just to be a faithful Catholic. I think that, again, there are problems in the liberal and conservative views that make it harder to be a faithful Catholic in those views. In my opinion, the best achievement of the ideal in terms of dealing with the legacy of Vatican II, I would point to two institutions. The first is the Toronto Oratory. So the Oratory is the Congregation of the Oratory is a religious order of priests that was founded in the 16th century by St. Philip Neri in Rome, and they have a house of priests in Toronto. It's called the Toronto Oratory. I think there are about 20, 25 priests who live there, and they live in community together, and they run a couple of parishes, and they run an elementary school and a seminary for priests. And when we lived in Toronto, my wife and I eventually made that our parish. And they offer both the new Mass and the Latin Mass every day, so both forms. Everybody can go to whichever one they like. They continue to study the old Catholic intellectual tradition. They teach in a somewhat, traditional way and so on, so they continue to study the old books, but they also accept all the documents of Vatican II, accept the teachings of the current popes, and just try to be faithful Catholics in that position, right? The other institution I would point to is the Monastery of Clear Creek in Oklahoma. I'm hoping to talk about that a bit on Tuesday. And now, finally, you had a reading. We've got about 5 minutes, so it was Thomas Stork, Religious Liberty, What Can We Believe? Now, this is directly dealing with some of the issues arising out of Vatican II. So, okay, this is the problem that the author sets out at the beginning. The author is a man named Thomas Stork. He says, essentially, it's commonly believed today by many Catholics that the decree on religious liberty overturned previous church teaching on this subject, right? It just overturned it, basically said it was wrong, here's the correct view. If that was the case, it would be a fundamental problem because it would destroy the whole credibility of the church. It's like, why should you believe the church now if it was wrong on a fundamental question for 2,000 years, right? Or 1,965 years. So, okay, that's the problem. So what he essentially does in the article is read the document very carefully and try to basically just understand it according to its own terms and see if it does essentially contradict the old teaching. This was actually, it was a very important article for me in my kind of figuring out the current situation in the church. I only read it maybe about a year ago or less. We've got another minute and a half left, so I'll wrap it up quickly. So, again, on the surface, the document appears to just reject previous traditional teaching. But there's a very important statement made in the first paragraph of the document. The key statement about, the church declares the individual has the right of religious liberty is 5 paragraphs in, maybe. But the first paragraph, what it says is, this document leaves untouched traditional Catholic teaching on the duties of the individual toward the true religion, and of the individual and the state toward the true religion. So it says, essentially, all of that is true, and we're not talking about that right now. So the thing is, this is where I would highlight a characteristic problem with the traditionalist outlook. The smoking gun for traditionalists who want to say Vatican II undermined or betrayed the Catholic faith is that document, Dignitatis Humanae, because it appears to most directly contradict previous teaching. The problem is, it specifically says in the first paragraph, before you read this document, understand we accept all the traditional teaching. And so you have to then read the document with that in mind and assume that it does fit in with previous teaching. And what the author, Thomas Stork, shows in this article is actually it does. If you put the two together, actually it does fit with traditional teaching. And even if you look up the subject in the Catechism, the subject of religious liberty, the footnotes cite all the old documents before Dignitatis Humanae as well as Dignitatis Humanae. I'm not going to go into the steps of the argument. It would be too much for today. But when I read the article, I thought, yeah, he's right. I had not seen how it fit together before. I thought it did appear to contradict, and I think his argument is completely successful. The problem with the traditionalist point of view, again, is typically a lot of traditionalists begin reading that document by saying, the whole point of this document is to overthrow the traditional Catholic faith. So it doesn't matter that they said that in the first paragraph. That's just a smokescreen. But again, you would never read the Council of Trent that way. You would never read any other document of a pope that way, with a kind of I'm assuming that they're conning me, so I'm not going to listen to them when they say something that doesn't fit with that narrative. So in any case, thanks for your attention.